All right. Hello. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Rebecca Lowe. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the Lewis Public Library. Just a couple of quick notes. So for folks in the room, now is the perfect time to silence your cell phones. So if you could please turn those off, that would be great. During the Q&A time, we're going to ask that you speak into a mic. We will have two people working the rooms with mics, and that's so that not only can people in the room hear you, but also so the people who are joining us via Zoom can hear you as well. And after the event is over, we're going to have book sales and signing afterwards over there. And for the folks who are joining us on Zoom, please keep yourself muted. Yes, hello, folks on Zoom. And yeah, unfortunately, folks on Zoom can't see the fireplace that we have burning in the room, so sorry. So if you could keep yourself muted, that would be great. And any questions that you have, type them into the chat and we will ask them for you. Just a quick reminder about our next Fireside Chat will be on Sunday, April 13th at 5 p.m. It will be here or it will be online, whichever you prefer. And it is How Artists Survived the Great Depression, featuring Paul Sparrow and Fred Dilla, who's in the room. Raise your hand there, Fred. Yay, Fred's coming back. All right, so let's talk about tonight's event. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Seaside Jewish Community, who are wonderful partners of ours. Thank you for doing this. Our guest this evening is Dr. Rebecca Brenner Graham. She is a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University. Previously, she taught at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she also received her PhD in history and an MA in public history. She also holds a BA in history. She likes history. And philosophy from Mount Holyoke College. In 2023, she was awarded a Cokie Roberts Fellowship from the National Archives Foundation and a Rubenstein Center Research Fellowship from the White House Historical Association. This series, the Fireside Chats, is moderated and organized by this man here, Paul Sparrow. Paul is a writer, historical consultant, and the former director of the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. Before moving to the FDR Library, he was the deputy director and senior vice president at the Museum in Washington, D.C., and he is the author of the book, Awakening the Spirit of America, which is for sale here tonight as well. So I'm going to turn it over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and a round of applause for Rebecca. She really is amazing. And hello, everybody out there. We have a big audience online tonight, so we appreciate you tuning in. And I am very excited about this conversation tonight. Rebecca reached out to me when she was working on the book, sent me an early draft of it, which I was very impressed with. I blurbed a little bit for her, and I've been following her rather remarkable success on the road as she's promoting her book. She has a much better publicist than I did. But I think it's a really refreshing new perspective on this historical figure who often doesn't get enough attention. So we're going to start. First of all, here's a book, buy it. I want to start with some of the sort of unusual jobs she had in the early part of her career in a rough and tumble New York City at the turn of the century. Talk about sort of how she got started and what gave her the grit to succeed later on when things really got crazy.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. To everyone who's been involved in inviting me, I've just had the best day in Lewis. Frances Perkins' career really started when she was an undergraduate at Mount Holyoke College. She took an American economic history class where the professor required students to visit the mills in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where she directly witnessed working people's conditions for the first time in her life. That made her want to go to New York City to get a job in the fledgling field of social work. But she could not do that because there were very few jobs for women. There were not that many women college graduates, and for them, there were not that many jobs. So one of my favorite Perkins letters of all time is when she writes to her Mount Holyoke classmates that she's destined to stay home and kill her father with her cooking. Like, not kill her father intentionally, but she did not want to stay home and cook and clean or anything like that. So she got a job as a science teacher in the Chicago area, but that wasn't really what she wanted to do. So she started volunteering at Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago. And that was how she truly got her start. She wrote to her friends, quote, "Social justice would be my vocation." It was truly what she wanted to do. That propelled her back to the East Coast, where once she had more experience, she was finally able to attain full-time work in what she wanted to do. She worked for settlement homes in Philadelphia. And then, after starting some graduate coursework at the Wharton School at Penn, she moved to New York City, where she continued studying sociology, economics, and politics at Columbia. I never remember the name of her actual degree. It was like economic sociology or something like that. And while in New York City, one of her early positions was at the New York Consumers League, where she was looking out for consumers, working people, and she was part of a broader network of women social reformers. While she was in that position, that was where she directly witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in the middle of New York City from across the street. That's something that no one wants to see. And for her, it propelled her to the next stage of her work. Former New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt appointed her to a statewide commission that would investigate factory conditions and fire safety and try to prevent such tragedies. And while doing that work, she caught the attention of the state government. She was then appointed to the New York Industrial Commission, where she worked under Governor Al Smith.
Okay, did you get all that? There will be a test. So Hull House in Chicago, and these settlement houses were where immigrants came in who had often no English, no skills, and like Eleanor Roosevelt's work with the settlement houses in New York, they would try to sort of help these people acclimatize. But I want to go back a little bit to the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, because some of you probably know something about it, but it really was sort of a turning point in the public's awareness of labor abuse. And the fact that Frances Perkins personally witnessed this is really quite amazing. So back up a little bit, explain what the Triangle Shirtwaist Company was, who worked there, and then what happened.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a shirtwaist factory. I don't know that much about the shirtwaist industry itself, but it involved cotton and making clothes. The people who worked there were mostly women, not all women, but mostly. They were almost all immigrants, like moved to the US from Europe. And the vast majority of them were Jewish and some were Italian. So
taking 10 cents or 5 cents a day.
The fire happened on a Saturday, which is telling in itself, because it was, after the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, that would be the weekend and there would be protections around hours working, but it happened on a Saturday. That was most of these women's Sabbath, if they were religious. And many of them had gone back into the building to obtain their hourly logs, because they were working, like you said, for such low wages that it was an existential threat to them if they couldn't get paid, because then they couldn't afford basic necessities. So they wanted to get their hourly logbooks in order to be paid. And also the factory was set up like a bottleneck to discourage people from taking any time off of work. So there was really, those are only two of a wide array of factors that increased the death toll. That was March 1911. Frances Perkins was 30 years old, I think. Yeah, she was about to turn 31 a few weeks later. And that was a formative moment for her.
The factory manager had locked all the doors and the windows were all sealed. So there was only one way out. and the fire was coming from beneath the workroom. So there was no way for the women to escape. And so they just jumped out the windows. And Frances
There
Perkins.
were a few survivors, and when I was a high school teacher for a few years, there was this YouTube clip of one of the survivors who was like over 100 years old when they recorded this for YouTube, and it was just an extraordinary story. But of course, traumatizing for everyone involved. Another key point I should have said earlier is that they had already been protesting the working conditions. Especially Jewish women immigrants were integral to the development of labor organizing and unions in the US. And Perkins had already been following that because she worked in labor politics and all of her friends did too. So there was really a sense of, but they told the factory owners, but they told the public, and the factory owners didn't listen. Documents suggest the factory owners, I don't think, felt that remorseful, like their testimony after it didn't seem that, but the general public felt bad that they had not intervened, and she was part of that.
Okay, now go back to the state commission that you got appointed to, because when she entered into sort of state government organizations, she was a woman on a mission. I mean, she was incredibly motivated to try to fix what she saw as these systemic problems and the abuse of the working class, particularly the immigrant working class. And there were no women doing this. So describe her reception on the commission when she was appointed and what she decided to try to accomplish in that sort of formal framework for the first time.
She worked on fire safety across the state. There are many pictures of her, like even if you just search Frances Perkins in Wikimedia Commons, pictures of her wearing like working clothes and sometimes holding ladders. And she would travel around New York investigating. And then that led to her appointment to Governor Al Smith's Industrial Commission.
He was the governor.
Yes, she would, and he served for many years. I always mess up the years because he had non-consecutive terms too. But she was like the first woman to serve on that. So by that point, the only women in the room were Frances Perkins and Al Smith's political advisor, Belle Moskowitz. Al Smith would bring his wife and sometimes even his mother into the room to ensure Perkins's comfort and respectability. Another key detail about her around this time is she got married around 1917 or so, and a few years later, her husband fell ill and could not support the family and their young daughters. So then she became the breadwinner of the family. So when she was on the Industrial Commission for the state of New York under Governor Al Smith, Perkins was a woman trying to survive with like a man's job. So she had a lot to navigate all the time. And that was the context in which she traveled around the state on the Industrial Commission. Much of her work by that point was based in Albany, not New York City, for like obvious reasons, state capital. How many of you are from New York? Just curious. Yeah, so you can probably picture the geography better than I can. But she would like stay over at the governor's house. Like she was a hard worker. She worked well with Al Smith. She, at that point, it was broader work than fire safety. She was helping to mediate labor disputes. She worked with workers. She worked with factory owners. One time she was a key player in preventing mining workers from like blowing up their workplace. I mean, there was some bad labor stuff, right? Exploitation on the job. And then someone wrote into the governor and said, ask the governor where, or to someone who worked for the governor, said, ask the governor where you found that woman. I use that quotation as a section title just because it highlights how successful she was. And then in 1928, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Okay, wait a minute. We're jumping ahead again.
No FDR yet, got it.
I may not get to talk again the rest of the day. Again, set the scene a little bit about what labor relations were like at that point. There were strikes where the corporate owners would send in thugs. The security divisions would go in. Workers were killed and shot. Bombs were set off. I mean, this was a very, very violent time in America. And there's sort of the closing years of the Gilded Age, before the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. And it really was a time when most of the people who were in rooms doing labor negotiations were mob guys, labor union leaders, and really corrupt businessmen. So this was a rough crowd that she was hanging out with. And I think you capture this beautifully in the book, she never backed down, but she had this unique ability to get people to agree.
Yes. She worked with Tammany Hall. Good point about the mob. I guess I should think about that more. I just haven't thought about it in that context. I can speak though to what her characteristic was. She didn't take it personally. And most people do, right? She didn't take things like that personally. They very rarely got to her. So she was there to do a job. She was there because she had witnessed people dying at work during the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. And yes, the labor conditions were very dangerous. And crucially, there was no legal mechanism for strikes and unions in the US. That wouldn't happen until 1935 with New Deal legislation in which she was integral.
So let's talk, before we get to FDR, let's talk about Eleanor and the sort of parallel tracks that they had and where those tracks finally intersected.
They definitely had parallel tracks. I think I've done 15 talks now. I think everyone except for one, somebody has asked me what's the relationship like between Frances and Eleanor. Frances Perkins was much closer with Franklin Roosevelt than with Eleanor Roosevelt. They worked closely together, great working relationship. She had a good working relationship with Eleanor. They were not close personal friends. They had nearly identical politics throughout their careers. What I find is interesting, and I would also call it parallel tracks, I've used that phrase before too, is that Frances Perkins became a full-time social reformer because she was the breadwinner for her family, whereas Eleanor Roosevelt became influential on social reform work because she married the most charismatic political figure of that era. And Perkins probably would have preferred to enter her work on the side, right? She would have probably preferred to stay home, but she didn't have that option. And I do think that a comparison between them is a book that somebody, not me, could write. Because of how, and I won't jump too far ahead as far as FDR, but by the end of the Roosevelt administration, Eleanor Roosevelt had a lot of influence and popularity, and Frances Perkins did not. And I would attribute that to the different roles, the different ways they got there, and how Frances Perkins as a government worker was a trailblazer, and that was truly hard.
So in 1928, Al Smith runs for president. He's governor of New York, runs for president, and convinces FDR to essentially come out of retirement. He's been in Warm Springs, Georgia, and trying to recover from his polio, to run for governor of New York. And Al and Franklin were good friends. They had first met years before when they were both in the state legislature. FDR entered Al's name into contention at the convention in 1924 when Al ran. He did it again in 1928. So they were good friends until Al Smith lost the election and Franklin Roosevelt won the election and became governor of New York. And so Al Smith sort of thought well, he's kind of handicapped. I'll just do the job. And Franklin, you can go to the parties. And Franklin was basically like, no. And so two of Al Smith's closest associates, Robert Moses, you all know who Robert Moses is, right? And Bell Moskowitz. He wanted FDR to keep them both on. And FDR basically said no. And a number of the people in Al Smith administration got pushed out because FDR wanted his people. But there was one person that he kept. Who was that?
Frances Perkins was a more natural choice for industrial commissioner of the state of New York than she was for Secretary of Labor. I mean, she had been the force behind the success of the state's industrial commission under Al Smith. I don't think that's an exaggeration in the labor mediation. And so also, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt as a Democrat, I mean, she was also the first woman cabinet secretary for the state of New York. I think he wanted that credit among the women's groups. I think he earned that credit among the women's groups. And that was really a natural fit. Also in 1928, the Great Depression hadn't started yet. So it just wasn't as high pressure yet, though it was about to be.
So when the Depression hits in October 29, and as governor, he starts trying to find ways to help people in the state of New York. He puts together his brains trust, with the guys from Columbia University. Frances sort of plays a consulting role with this and starts getting involved with these ideas about how do you use government policy to help people who are suffering. I mean, a lot of governments weren't really doing that in America at the time. So talk about that, how her sort of role transformed a little bit after the Depression hit and how it prepared her for the transition to Washington.
Perkins was industrial commissioner for the state of New York for 4 years, and it was essentially Secretary of Labor on a statewide level. The Great Depression hit about a year into Roosevelt's gubernatorial administration, and public works programs became a clear part of their agenda, putting people back to work across the state of New York in ways that would benefit the public good. And in the process, entrenching the state government into the state economy. And there were also elements of the what would become the Social Security Act, what would become the Fair Labor Standards Act, that were tested out at a state level. So that's what she was doing before she became U.S. Secretary of Labor. And then when he ran for president and won in 1932, she was less of an automatic choice for a lot of reasons. I mean, there's the fact that she would be the first woman cabinet secretary, but she was also the first Secretary of Labor, a relatively new department from 1913, who was not a trade unionist. I mean, it was not really in Roosevelt's political interest to provoke backlash from organized labor, and he did that.
One of his biggest constituents.
And he kind of made an exception for that political priority because she represented a broader labor reform movement that was woman-led. So, I mean, it's the start of Women's History Month, and representation of women is important, but also there's usually something beyond that. By appointing a woman cabinet secretary, he was appointing a representative of a broader woman social movement that had centered things like child labor as another detail that she had worked on for the state of New York. And also by being not a trade unionist, she was more pro-immigrant than previous secretaries of labor. So there were many congratulatory messages that Roosevelt received for appointing her in early 1933. There was also pushback, and not only from the misogynists that you might imagine, also from the AFL saying, well, why isn't it an AFL guy that's in there at the Department of Labor? And another consideration was that her husband was hospitalized in New York and her daughter was in high school in New York, and she did not aspire to leave New York and move to Washington, D.C. And I think we're probably about to get into the start of the Roosevelt administration, but just one detail to highlight that. When she went to Washington for inauguration, she had a train ticket and a couple nights in a hotel, and she intended to turn around and go back to New York. And then she had to stay in Washington for a national banking crisis, and the owner of the Willard Hotel downtown made an exception for her to stay longer.
So the part of your book that I enjoyed a great deal was when she tells FDR no. Not many people told FDR no, particularly at that moment in time. Talk about that.
He got his way.
He got his way, but she gave him a hard time, and she turned down 3 times, right?
And she also tried to resign like 3 times, and he never took her up.
And the health issues with her husband were both mental and medical.
Yeah, mental health is health. He had bipolar disorder, and there was no treatment.
So it was very traumatic for her. She would get these calls from the hospital saying, your husband's in really bad shape. Can you come? And she's like, well, I'm drafting the Social Security Act right now. Can I wait till tomorrow? And then she was commuting back and forth to New York for a large part of this period. So she was under really extraordinary domestic pressure within her family to try to keep her family going at a point where she was under such a microscope. Everything she did, the clothes she wore, the people she went out with, everything was absolutely scrutinized and criticized in the press. And now you've all seen the photographs of her. She always looks a little dour with the tricorn hat and the dark clothes and everything. But she hung out with kind of a little bit of a fast crowd in Washington. You want to talk about them a little bit?
I see Frances Perkins's 2 foremost strengths were how she was always prepared and her network. I would distill a wide array of things she did well into those 2 buckets. And you asked me about her network. She worked very well with many women, and she also worked well with many men. And at the beginning of the Roosevelt administration, she got to know the other cabinet secretaries. She got to know the other people in her department. And then in Washington, D.C., she lived for a while. Her roommate was Mary Harriman Rumsey, who had then died tragically in a horse accident pretty early on in the administration. Actually, she was good friends with Caroline O'Day on Capitol Hill, who also died before the end of the administration. But she had a lot of good friends, a lot of tragedy in her personal life. And another example of someone she hung out with in DC was in New York. She had been friends with writer Sinclair Lewis, who had actually proposed marriage to her. She was not interested, but they did stay friends. He married journalist Dorothy Thompson, who was one of the first Americans to report on the rise of Nazi Germany to the American public. So
also the first American to get kicked out of Germany for reporting on the rise of Hitler.
Not for calling Hitler evil, but for calling him irrelevant, which is important. And she heard directly from Dorothy Thompson what was happening at a dinner party in Washington, D.C. So that was a source of information that she had that not everyone did.
Now, did Sinclair Lewis write about her?
Yes. I don't read a lot of classic literature. I have not read this one, but Anne Vickers, I'm like so proud of myself that I remember the title of this book I haven't read. Anne Vickers has characters that are based off of Frances Perkins, Dorothy Thompson, and then a third woman in his life that I forget. I think I've just convinced myself to read it. Dorothy Thompson is like my favorite side character in my book. I just think she's fascinating, and she comes up a couple times.
Should I do a program on Dorothy Thompson? We probably should, because I reference her in my book as well, because she's the one that called Charles Lindbergh a moron. That was one of the nicer things she said about him.
He wasn't the only one.
All right, so now we can talk about her relationship with FDR, because there was a caveat to what she demanded of him in exchange for accepting the role, and it played a pretty big through line in their relationship for the next 12 years.
She had an agenda. She had a several point plan of legislative priorities that she wanted the administration to focus on to counter the Great Depression, but to transform the American government's relationship to its people in the process. The Roosevelt administration achieved all of them except for universal health care.
And when you look at the pictures of the cabinet, the FDR's cabinet's all these white guys, and there's Frances. And you look at the signing ceremonies, whenever they would sign a big piece of legislation, especially the first 100 days of New Deal, all these guys are standing around. Frances is usually sort of in the back, hidden. And she was never one of FDR's buddies, right? She didn't come to the children's hour. She didn't go drinking. She didn't get to go out on the boat, the yachts and stuff. But she was the one who did so much of the work particularly in those critical areas that we now think about around New Deal, child labor laws, 40-hour work week, workman's compensation, all of those things. So talk about the effect she had on the crafting of those New Deal legislation and the, what should we say, the competitors she had on the cabinet itself. Not everyone reveled in her successes.
Biographer Kirsten Downey always says that Frances Perkins was a workhorse, not a show horse. And this would fall into the bucket I said earlier about how she was always prepared. She encouraged Franklin Roosevelt to create the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the head of that, Isidore Lubin, had offices in both Perkins's Department of Labor and the West Wing of the White House. Yeah, she was in the room when all of the key pieces of New Deal legislation were drafted. Social Security Act in 1935, National Labor Relations Act in 1935, and the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. I mean, I think those are the three biggest pieces of New Deal legislation. I also think they're the pieces of her work in the Roosevelt administration that she was most proud of and that she talked about the most in her memoir, The Roosevelt I Knew. My book is about refugee policy, and that's mostly a sad story. So I think that she cared about it a lot, but there were very few successes that she could point to in the way that she could for those pieces of legislation. Frances Perkins later said that the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire was the day the New Deal was born. She had seen these ideas about fair labor standards evolve from 1911 through the 1930s.
So 1933 is when the first New Deal legislation is passed. The first 100 days, sort of extraordinary 15 major pieces of legislation. And then in 1935, as you just pointed out, that there's this another sort of wave of New Deal legislation that gets passed, particularly Social Security, which she had been fighting for from the very beginning. She really pushed for a national health care component to the Social Security Act, but they just couldn't make the numbers work. Somebody recently called it a Ponzi scheme.
And it was Senator Robert Wagner's personal secretary had a comment on the books later that basically, I forget the exact wording, but basically Franklin Roosevelt would not have done Social Security if not for Frances Perkins.
Absolutely true. But so right in this period, sort of 1935, 1936, the situation in Europe deteriorates very, very quickly. And there's this realization that there's a immediate refugee problem, particularly with Jews in Eastern Europe and Germany. But there's also going to be this bigger refugee problem if things continue to deteriorate. And you don't think of, when you think of the War Refugee Board and the Holocaust, you don't think of it as a labor issue. But in fact, it was a labor issue, and Frances was quite brilliant, although oft opposed, in the way she used the power that she had as labor secretary. This is a little bit complicated, but if you could sort of walk us through how it is that she became such an important figure in this period.
The Immigration Naturalization Service was under the Department of Labor from 1933 to 1940. So by the time the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, immigration was no longer in the Labor Department. By the time the War Refugee Board was created in 1944, immigration had not been in the Labor Department for like almost 5 years. Frances Perkins in 1933, after a cabinet meeting, walked to her office in where the Labor Department building used to be on G Street in Washington, D.C., and several different men told her that they were in charge of immigration. And that was a red flag for her, just like in terms of workplace organization. So she asked the president for an executive order combining the Immigration Bureau and the Naturalization Bureau to create the Immigration Naturalization Service, the INS. Now, at that point in spring 1933, Adolf Hitler had been Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Since January 1933, he had written and spoke about his political philosophy, which was an existential threat to Jewish people in Germany, just because they would no longer be able to hold jobs and support their family. Hence the influx of applications to immigrate. And that was happening alongside this reform of the new Immigration Naturalization Service. Frances Perkins did things like creating rooms for social workers to work out of in Ellis Island so that they could advocate for new immigrants. She made it so an INS employee would have to apply to arrest someone to deport them, and that they couldn't just do that based on rogue ad hoc discretion, which is what they had been doing since basically until she became labor secretary. So then later in spring 1933, once this immigration reform was in motion, once she had heard harrowing tales of Nazi Germany from Dorothy Thompson, she came to a cabinet meeting that April with a plan to use something called a charge bond, which maybe we may or may not get into, but it's chapter 4 of the book. And she really went head to head with the State Department on that. They did not want her to use this mysterious, complicated thing called a charge bond. And the Attorney General said that she could. And even though she didn't, and we can get into that, it did give her political leverage, which she had at the beginning of the Roosevelt administration. Throughout the Roosevelt administration, or throughout the time that the INS was in the Labor Department, there was significant overlap between these immigration issues and the other New Deal policies, like we've already discussed. And it just snowballed into, I don't want to get too far ahead, but there was a resolution to impeach her in February 1939. And that made immigration a political third rail. It attached her to it, and it kind of made her a political third rail.
Yeah, we've talked about this in other programs where America was very anti-immigrant, it was very anti-Semitic. Congress was overwhelmingly isolationist and anti-Semitic, and the idea of giving jobs to immigrants when you could give those jobs to Americans was a politically charged issue. We'll just let that go. And the opposition she was feeling was that other members of the cabinet wanted to get control of this process of allowing immigrants to come into the country. And the next time she mentions the State Department, it's okay to hiss, because they were at odds.
The State Department was in charge of visas before. Oh my God, they hissed. The State Department. Oh my God. Wow, I'm not going to say it again. That's freaking me out a little bit. They were in charge of visas before immigrants entered the country. The Labor Department was in charge of visa policy after the immigrants entered the country. The reason that Secretary of State Cordell Hull did not like the charge bond was because it would have given Perkins a say in certain visas before the immigrant reached the country.
So this issue around how do you secure a visa into this country, a lot of that had to do with, do you have a job when you get there, right? And the public, what was it called?
So the close ties between jobs and immigration were strengthened by the Immigration Act of 1965. There was definitely precedent for that in the 1930s, but the law of the land was the National Origins Act of 1924, which dictated how many people could come from each country. It was like several tens of thousands from England and like 100 from Korea. And that was kind of how it went.
There was also a rule about public charge. They didn't want immigrants coming into the country and the country having to support them.
So those were the quota laws, what I just described. There were also non-quota immigrants, which could sometimes immigrate if they had a certain job. Like, for example, Albert Einstein would have immigrated on a non-quota visa. And then there were visitor visas, which were definitely in the Department of Labor because they were often for people traveling on business. One example would be the delightful singing family, the Von Trapp family singers, and she extended their visitor visas a couple times. When you refer to likely to become a public charge, so that phrase is from the Immigration Act of 1917, which is the Restrictive Immigration Act that barred the Asiatic zone, so most people from Asian countries, and also people with physical and mental disabilities, including all of them. And also there was a literacy test in the 1917 Act. And then there was this phrase, likely to become a public charge. And at the height of the Great Depression, there are many years that historians call the height of the Great Depression. Like I've literally heard 30 or 33. And I'll just say in 1930, President Herbert Hoover, feeling a height of the Great Depression, instructed the State Department consuls overseas to adhere strictly to the likely to become a public charge clause. The German quota was comparatively high because the quota system was based off of late 19th century census data, and there had been a ton of like white German immigrants to the US. So what was actually preventing people from immigrating to Germany was the ad hoc discretion of the State Department consuls, saying that Jewish applications for immigration who probably had lost their jobs because the Nazis were in power were likely to become a public charge.
And so this ability to have a job ready for you was going through the Labor Department and gave Frances Perkins enormous leverage in helping these people. And there's a couple of Dear Miss Perkins letters about people who wrote to her personally to try to get their relatives into the country. You want to just tell one of those stories? I know you must have several favorites.
Okay, so people who wrote to her to have their relatives come into the country. A quick example that comes to mind is one where she was unable to help, which is that, and it will also help to illustrate some of the immigration laws that I just mentioned. Perkins's dentist, Eugene Wiseman, had a cousin named Andre Verity, who was a businessman in Austria, and he was Jewish. And Andre Verity was born in Hungary. So that meant that Andre Verity, his wife, and also their young daughter had to count under the Hungarian quota and not the Austrian one. The Austrian one was significantly larger than the Hungarian one because of prejudice against Eastern Europe, I guess, or Central Eastern Europe. So that was one reason why they couldn't come, because after Andre Verity was temporarily transported to a concentration camp after Kristallnacht, not a death camp yet, but still a very bad situation. By the time that family was applying for immigration in 1938, the Hungarian quota waitlist was 10 to 12 years long for the rest of the war. So what always stood out to me about that example is that the cousin was her dentist. Like that's sort of like close proximity, intimate relationship. And then the cousin who was trapped in Nazi territory still could not go through the laws to get here. This topic was originally my senior thesis over a decade ago. And at the end of that process, I did not know what happened to Verity. While researching the book, I learned that he did immigrate to New Zealand with his family and survived. But of course, his case is representative of other Hungarian businessmen who did not for those reasons.
Okay, we're getting a little short on time, so we have to talk about impeachment. As you can tell, she was dealing with a lot of very politically controversial and weighted issues in a very intense moment in American history, the late 30s. After 1939, obviously, the war breaks out. Talk about who wanted to impeach her and how she responded to this, really direct attack on her authority and her reputation.
There were a couple of congressmen who wanted to impeach her, and they had the support of many of their voters. In 1920, a man named Harry Bridges immigrated to the US from Australia. In 1932, he became the spokesman for a union of dock workers on the West Coast. In 1934, those dock workers led a successful strike and won better working conditions and pay, and Harry Bridges had spearheaded it. And at that point, nobody is trying to impeach Frances Perkins over it. Until 1935, National Labor Relations Act provides legal mechanisms for strikes and unions. Perkins, as we've mentioned, was integral to its passage. And at that point, the anti-New Dealers took notice. So the attempts to impeach her on an immigration case were both backlash to her progressive immigration policy and also backlash to the National Labor Relations Act. And for a few years, it snowballed. She received hate mail. The congressmen were not the ones concocting the conspiracy theory that she was secretly a Jewish immigrant named Matilda Watsky, but that was also a thing that happened. And here's the thing about that conspiracy theory. Frances Perkins received backlash throughout her career and very rarely responded. She responded to that one. That's how real this story that sounds absurd was. There's a letter in the FDR library, in the Lowell Millet papers, where she had to explain her ancestry. And in that letter, she said that if she were Jewish, she would be proud, but that she was not. The reason that they wanted her to be Jewish was because then they could also wield antisemitism against her, and they wanted to use all the tools in their bigotry toolbox to bring her down. She was not impeached because the charge was treason, and there were no legal grounds to impeach her for treason. So I haven't mentioned what I actually think is the most interesting piece here. And I guess I'll plug, I have an essay about this specific story in Made by History at Time Magazine this Tuesday on the historical anniversary of Perkins's cabinet appointment. But here's what I think actually matters about the impeachment. When she gave testimony on Capitol Hill, she said to these angry, bigoted congressmen, she said, if Congress made a law that I had to deport someone for being a communist, I would do it. If the Supreme Court decided that being a communist is grounds for deportation, I would do it. At that moment, there actually was a case in the US Supreme Court, the George Strecker case, to decide whether communism was adequate grounds to deport an immigrant. But that law had not been passed. The Supreme Court did not decide that case. So she made her argument on legal grounds that she was following the law. She didn't come there in there yelling and screaming about how they made a mountain into a molehill into a mountain, mountain into a molehill. I don't know. They'd grossly exaggerated things. It definitely got to her, as is evident in some of her other correspondence, but in her testimony, the point that she made was that she followed the laws that existed, and she did not wildly interpret them beyond reasonable interpretation, and therefore there were no grounds to impeach or convict.
So 1940 is sort of this transitional moment as INS comes out. Those of you who read my book know that there's another intersection point between us here, which is the 1940 Democratic National Convention, where FDR is running for unprecedented third term. He gets acclaimed. There's a big fight that breaks out about who his vice president is going to be. It's chaos on the floor. And who calls Eleanor Roosevelt to come to the rescue? Frances Perkins. Because everybody else had called her, and she had said, no, I'm not going. I'm not going to step into that mess. But she respected Frances Perkins so much, and she knew that Frances was so level-headed that if Frances was freaking out, the situation had to be really bad. Anyway.
That is true.
So things start to change at this point now as we ramp up for the war, certainly after Pearl Harbor. As FDR says, Dr. New Deal is now Dr. Win the War. And so the labor relations issues become very different because now it's about how to prevent workers from striking. Now it's about how do we up our productivity and up industrialization. And her role sort of shifts a little bit, both within the administration and the whole concept of the Labor Department shifts in terms of the war effort. Can you talk about that? We have a little bit of time left, and then we'll go to wrap up.
The impeachment hearing that we just discussed was in early 1939. By mid-1939, there was talk of transferring the INS. Perkins's department produced a memo with reasons that immigration should be civil, not in the Department of Justice. That held up for about 6 months. In mid-1940, the INS formally moved from the Labor Department to the Justice Department for 3 reasons. There was backlash to the impeachment. There was also, I'm glad you mentioned the 1940 election, because that was shaping all of Franklin Roosevelt's decisions in 1940, and the transfer of the INS was no exception. And then there was also, the transfer itself was in Congressional Reorganization Act number 5. There were many pieces of legislation that were rearranging parts of the federal government with a specific eye toward World War II. The US had not entered yet, but World War II had started in Europe in September 1939, and by 1940, that was what was on Roosevelt's mind. So that, in my book, does mark Frances Perkins's huge chance to help refugees because the INS is no longer under her oversight. Occasionally, she would still forward what she knew about individual cases to the Department of Justice. Some of the people who worked in the INS for her transferred to the Department of Justice, and other times there were new appointees. Her second commissioner of immigration, James Hoftelling. Do you know if it's Hoftelling or Hodling? Because my audiobook narrator, who probably knows more than I do, says Hodling. But anyway, the commissioner of immigration...
Don't know, sorry.
The commissioner of immigration did not keep his job when it transferred, and there are kind of hilarious letters at the FDR library that say, well, no one thought he was doing a good job anyway, and now it's transferring. So anyway, James H. lost his job. So the INS had taken up a lot of Perkins's brain energy and workspace, and that was a huge change for the structure of the Department of Labor when it moved. Like you said, the Labor Department was a participant in efforts to mobilize for World War II. I know there are specific examples that I've read about. I'm not an expert on those. The main crux of my book ends in 1940 with the transfer of the INS. Biographer Kirsten Downey writes that in World War II, politics became, or at least elite politics became more of a boys' game than it had been because it was a war. Plus, she had already been politically sidelined by the impeachment hearing.
Okay, we're going to take questions in just a minute, so be thinking up. But I want to talk about legacy because there are a few women who impacted our life today, from their roles they played, 80 years ago, more than Frances Perkins. I've always put her on the same level with Eleanor Roosevelt, and I think that there's a interesting arc to how she was very, very famous during her era and then sort of just disappears from the history books for a period, and then is sort of resurrected in the 1970s and is getting more and more recognition today. So talk about her legacy and what it means for the situation we find ourselves in today.
Chapter 13 of my book focuses on how memory of Frances Perkins has changed over time. It ends in 2023 because that's when my manuscript was due. But let me tell you briefly what happens in that chapter, and then I'll end with what I've noticed since then. So Frances Perkins published The Roosevelt I Knew in 1946. She did it in large part because, I mean, she didn't particularly love writing and she hated attention. She wrote it in large part because the advance for the book was larger than her government salary as Secretary of Labor, and she needed to support her family. In that book, she writes about Roosevelt's achievements. How did she know so much detail about them? She was in the room doing them. But she attributes them to him, right? Because that's her whole vibe. So then Frances Perkins as a name gradually disappears. She taught in Illinois for a bit. She taught at Cornell. There's a group of men that had her as a professor at Cornell. And some of them even lived with her because she lived in like an academic fraternity house where they invited her as an honorary member for the last few years of her life. And they're still alive. Like there are people alive who knew her during that stage. She died in 1965. She did ask for the phrase from the Bible, "Be ye steadfast," to be included in her funeral. It had also been part of her speech as class president to her Mount Holyoke senior class of 1902. So "Be ye steadfast" is how she wanted to be remembered. But then she continued to become more obscure. In 1987, there's a movie called Dirty Dancing. You may have seen it. There's a character named Baby who tells her love interest that Baby is short for, quote, Frances after the first woman in the cabinet, end quote. I was recently giving a talk at a synagogue where someone there was the costume designer for Dirty Dancing. And she told me something that I did not know or include in the book, which is that the reason behind the name, she said it was like Joan of Arc, like it was someone who was righteous. It was someone whose memory was basically sacred. So it's not like no one knew who she was, but people watching Dirty Dancing, especially younger audiences at the time, would view her as a quirky fun fact. And that's how she continued to be like a trivia answer for a couple more decades until the early 21st century, when journalist Kirsten Downey, who lives in Washington, D.C., was on a bus tour of the nation's capital because she had like friends visiting from out of town. And the tour guide made a misogynist joke that Perkins was in labor for 12 years. And that set Kirsten Downey on a mission to figure out who is this person, what did she do? Kirsten Downey produced a book, The Woman Behind the New Deal, which is a great read. It came out in 2009. That same year, the new Frances Perkins Center in Maine was established by several key players up there, including Perkins's grandson, Tomlin Coggeshall. And they created a homestead and a nonprofit organization to preserve Perkins's legacy. I would argue as a historian that in order for someone to be a historical icon, they need both a compelling narrative and an institutional home base. So by 2009, she suddenly had both of those things. And then in the 2010s, there was the first major party Democratic, or the first major party woman nominee for president. And she lost, but that made the general public more interested in women first. This coming Tuesday, March 4th, is what I call Frances Perkins Social Media Day, meaning that everyone from Hillary Clinton to Elizabeth Warren to Billie Jean King to sometimes they're really surprising people post that it's the historical anniversary of the first woman cabinet secretary, March 4th, 1933. That brings us to 2024, when the Frances Perkins Center homestead in Maine became a national monument. So it is now a National Park Service site. That happened in December 2024. So she is a moral icon on the rise. And there are many components that we can draw out of what's relevant for her today. One of them is that in my book, even though there's one person's face on the cover, nobody is doing all of the action. She worked very well with other people. She collaborated with a Jewish activist named Cecilia Rozovsky on a robust child refugee program. Cecilia Rozovsky would even greet the children at Ellis Island upon arrival. She worked closely with Isidore Lubin at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Harold Ickes was one of her friends in the cabinet, the Secretary of the Interior. She understood that she couldn't do everything, and so much of her strength was knowing what she could do well and then letting other people do things too.
Let's have a round of applause and then we'll take questions. Great job. Raise your hand if you have a question. We'll bring a microphone around to you.
All right, we do have one from online real quick, which was, what is something you learned about Perkins during your research that you haven't had the opportunity to talk about yet?
Well, I've been doing a lot of talking. I've been doing so much talking that I lost my voice during the first week after my book came out. I mean, okay, here's something I've never said in a talk. And this is something that I saw in the archives during the first stint of this project over a decade ago. When around the time that her best friend and roommate died, she totaled her car. I haven't seen this piece of information since I think fall 2014, but the reason it was in the archives is because she wrote to someone in the federal government and she said, under no I remember this document as clear as day. I haven't seen it in over a decade. I should probably go back and find it. She said, under no circumstances will the federal government pay for my car. And maybe she should have let them pay for her car. I mean, she was really struggling here, but that actually showed there's a fascinating contrast. And here's an actual answer to the question, because I haven't talked about this in a talk. There is a contrast between her personal belief and individual responsibility. I mean, sometimes she comes across like she might have been one of her Puritan ancestors. And she also has this really deep-seated belief in collective action and structural support for people struggling, even though for herself personally, she wouldn't even let her employer help her with her primary means of transportation.
Okay, we have one over here, and I saw one over there.
Very informative hour as usual. Only if we had a cabinet secretary like that now, right? Could you tell us more about her family? You mentioned her grandson.
Should we start with her American Revolutionary ancestors, or
it's almost 6 o'clock, so we'll.
In the interest of time, she married a man named Paul Wilson who worked in New York politics. She definitely married for love, the documents would suggest. He had a breakdown. His boss at the time actually died by suicide, and that was really the last straw for him to really lose the battle to his bipolar disorder. Unfortunately, he was hospitalized. There was really no effective treatment during that time. And so she was responsible financially for her husband and for their daughter, Susanna. Susanna also really struggled in a lot of ways. Even after Susanna became an adult, Perkins was still financially responsible for her at times. Susanna had sometimes a challenging relationship with her mother, Frances Perkins. They were just extremely different in terms of just their disposition. Like Frances Perkins was really cards close to the chest, kind of like a Puritan. Susanna seems fun. Like Susanna would have been fun to talk to, fun to spend time with, go out to dinner with. And in her second marriage, she had one son named Tomlin. Tomlin actually lived at the homestead, like it was his house, until the Frances Perkins Center did a capital campaign to purchase it from him. Tomlin died of cancer earlier this year. There will be a memorial service for him in Maine. I think it's on May 31st. Personally, when he died, I searched his contact in my email inbox to see what our last correspondence was. He said he liked the title of my book. I don't think that he read it because he was sick and dying with cancer, but I'm glad to know that Tomlin liked the title, Dear Miss Perkins.
Okay, we had one over here. Did I see a hand over here? Oh, we have one here.
Was there a particular letter that inspired your title?
The title came from a conversation with my senior thesis advisor during the first stint of this project. The title throughout the year had been The Efforts of Frances Perkins to Aid Refugees from Nazi Germany, which is
Great title. Great title.
part of that made its way into the subtitle. And then he's like, that sucks. So then a different professor, I mean, why not? Joseph Ellis, who's like kind of a famous historian, suggested Madam Redeemer. And then my thesis advisor said, absolutely not. It's probably reflective of some departmental politics. And then at the very end of the year, when I was like trying to hit the senior thesis deadline, which almost didn't happen. And frankly, this was a book length project that I did as a senior thesis. And I was like walking back to my dorm in tears because I was stressed. And that was when I thought of the title, Dear Miss Perkins. I am not good at coming up with titles, but my agent could have changed it. Multiple people at my publishing company could have changed it. And the title of my first book is something I came up with while crying in college. And I love that for me.
All right, it's 6 o'clock. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rebecca. Great job.
Thank you.
She'll be over there signing books. You can buy more in the back, and I'll hopefully see you all in a month. Thank you.